30 CE, an occupied territory. A wisdom teacher is executed by the empire. His followers memorize his sayings. For 40 years, nothing is written down. The followers of Jesus were oral traditionists who expected an imminent, world-shifting change. In their view, the current order of the world was ending, making permanent written archives unnecessary for their immediate future. This reliance on human recall introduced a specific kind of pressure. Spoken memory is active. As teachings are passed between people, they naturally stretch and adapt to meet the needs of the moment. As the movement traveled, the language itself shifted. The original Aramaic aphorisms of first-century Judea had to be translated into Greek to reach the broader audiences of the Roman Mediterranean. This 40-year silence functions as a dynamic crucible. Before the first word reached a page, the living tradition had already been reshaped and translated to meet the needs of diverse new communities. Between 50 and 60 CE, the expanding movement faced a new challenge, explaining a crucified state criminal to Gentile outsiders. A Gentile is a person who is not Jewish, often operating within a completely different cultural and theological framework than the original followers. Paul's letters serve as our primary evidence for this period. Even though he wrote extensively to these new communities, he rarely quotes the historical teachings of Jesus, focusing instead on his own theological interpretations. The breaking point arrived in 70 CE. The Roman Empire crushed a Jewish rebellion and destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem, shown here in this relief of soldiers carrying away the temple's menorah. With the movement's center destroyed and the original eyewitnesses dying off, the need to preserve memory became urgent. Oral tradition had to be locked into permanent text to ensure the sect's survival. The Roman-Jewish War forced this transformation. To endure the collapse of their world, a decentralized apocalyptic group had to become a text-based, organized institution. This crisis created an evolutionary bottleneck for memory. Intense historical pressure is a selective force. It preserves specific types of data while letting others fade. Scholar John Kloppenborg's research shows that short, distinctive, and counterintuitive wisdom survives this process much better than complex chronological biographies. We see this in the command to love your enemies. This saying appears across multiple independent sources. It survives because it is so radically different from expected human wisdom that an endangered community would be unlikely to invent it for their own convenience. The surviving, punchy aphorisms represent the earliest, most authentic layers of the tradition. These sayings predate the narrative frameworks and stories that eventually surrounded them. This ancient manuscript contains the Gospel of Mark. Written around 70 CE, it provides the very first narrative structure for the life of Jesus, emerging directly from the chaos of the Roman destruction. By 80 or 90 CE, Matthew and Luke were writing their own accounts. They worked as secondary compilers rather than independent witnesses to the original events. This diagram shows the relationship between the texts. Matthew and Luke both used the Gospel of Mark as their primary base, adopting its structure and timeline as the skeleton for their own books. Mark provided the narrative framework, but we have to remember that this sequence was constructed decades after the actual events. It is a later device used to organize isolated memories into a story. A major anomaly appears when we look closer. Matthew and Luke share a massive amount of identical material that is completely missing from Mark. Scholars call this shared material Q, short for quell or source. It is a lost document reconstructed by looking at what Matthew and Luke have in common. It contains no stories of Jesus' birth or death, only the raw wisdom sayings that made it through the oral bottleneck. Q allows us to see how ideas mutated over time. In the earlier version preserved in Luke, the saying is direct, "Blessed are you who are poor." In Matthew's later version, he adds a qualification, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." By the time Matthew was writing, the movement had expanded from rural Galilee into more affluent urban centers. Matthew reflects this shift in his audience by reframing a striking declaration about physical poverty into an internal spiritual disposition. That other source, the one Matthew and Luke share, the one Mark doesn't have, is what this series is built on. Scholars call it Q. If you look closely at the texts that form the foundation of Christianity, you will find a ghost. Scholars call it Q, which comes from the German word Quille. This diagram shows the relationship between the earliest records. Notice the anomaly. Matthew and Luke share 235 verses of Jesus' sayings, often with identical wording, that are completely absent from the Gospel of Mark. This specific overlap suggests they were both copying from a shared secondary source that is now lost. To understand the origin of this source, we have to look at the years following 30 CE. After the execution of Jesus, his followers lived in an oral tradition, expecting the world to change imminently. They repeated his teachings and gathered for meals, but they saw no reason to commit anything to text. This timeline reveals a significant gap. For nearly 4 decades, the teachings existed only as memories. Jesus spoke in Aramaic, the local language of Judea, but the first written records were composed in Greek by a later generation who had never met him. The transition from memory to writing was triggered by catastrophe. In 70 CE, the Roman Empire destroyed Jerusalem and its temple. With the original witnesses dying and their world in ruins, the movement finally produced its first narrative record, the Gospel of Mark. While the narrative Gospels appeared much later, Q preserves the sayings that circulated during that initial oral transmission. It provides the content that filled the decades between the execution and the first narrative accounts. The text of Q is not a single uniform block. Scholar John Kloppenborg analyzed it using stratigraphy, a method that maps internal layers similar to archaeological sediment. He discovered that the document was built in stages over time. The surface layer, which scholars call Q2, contains apocalyptic warnings. These are passages focused on judgment and the end of the world. This layer reflects the concerns of a later community, trying to establish correct beliefs and boundaries. Digging beneath those warnings reveals the bedrock layer, Q1. This foundational stratum consists of pure wisdom sayings, short aphorisms with no birth narrative, no crucifixion, and no demand for worship. We can see how these early sayings were later adapted by comparing different versions of the Beatitudes. The earlier Q1 version says, "Blessed are you who are poor," a direct statement about socioeconomic reality. Matthew's later version adds "in spirit," shifting the focus to an internal disposition. By isolating these layers, we can observe the transition from the original wisdom of Jesus to a religion built around his identity. To verify which sayings likely originated with the historical Jesus, scholars use the criteria of authenticity. These are specific historical tests used to evaluate the probability that a particular quote belongs to the original figure rather than being a later invention. One tool is the criterion of embarrassment. The early church was unlikely to invent a saying that made Jesus or the movement appear weak, difficult, or out of step with their own growing traditions. Another tool is dissimilarity. Sayings that break away from both the established Jewish tradition of the time and the later creeds of the church are highly distinctive. They represent a voice that neither group would have naturally created. While these criteria provide a strong framework, moving from a reconstructed theory to a historical fact requires independent physical evidence from the ancient world. In 1945, near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, a discovery provided that evidence. A local farmer found a collection of papyri, including the Gospel of Thomas. This physical document independently contains many of the same sayings found in the reconstructed Q source. This provides multiple attestation, a tool used to cross-reference independent sources. When Q, the Gospel of Thomas, and early church records all preserve the same difficult teaching, like love your enemies, the historical evidence for its origin is significantly strengthened. It was a teaching so distinct that leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. would later use it as a cornerstone for social action. These forensic tools allow us to isolate a specific historical voice from the various layers of tradition that followed. This methodology is widely used across the academic world. While the details of specific sayings are still debated, the process of separating early historical material from later tradition is a standard practice in the study of antiquity. This process helps us distinguish between the early wisdom teacher and what scholars call high Christology. High Christology is a theological perspective that emphasizes the divinity and cosmic significance of Jesus, a development seen most clearly in later texts like the Gospel of John. We analyze these later theological additions to reach the core teachings before they were formalized by church councils and institutional creeds. The tools provided in this module allow you to examine these layers for yourself. You can strip away the centuries of theology to see what remains of the original message at the center. The method is solid. The recovery is possible. The transition from those early sayings to a formalized religion involved a massive expansion of content. Over the decades, a Jewish mystic's provocations were surrounded by narratives and doctrines that would eventually define a Roman religion. In the year 325 CE, 318 bishops gathered at the Council of Nicaea. They met to resolve a high-stakes debate over the precise nature of Jesus' divinity, where the losing argument faced immediate exile. 3 centuries earlier, the Roman Empire executed Jesus as a political threat to state order. Now, the Roman emperor presides over a council of Jesus' followers while wearing imperial robes. This Arian controversy, a dispute over whether Jesus was subordinate to God or co-equal, formed the core of the council. Arius argued for subordination, while Athanasius argued for equality. Political voting and imperial pressure ultimately settled this metaphysical friction. The agenda excluded the social and ethical concerns of the earliest communities. There were no debates regarding wealth inequality, the institution of slavery, or the practice of enemy love within an imperial context. The Council of Nicaea operated as an imperial editorial board meeting. It aligned a subversive movement with the operating logic of a global superpower. In December 312 CE, on the eve of the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine claimed a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Constantine placed this Chi-Rho symbol on his soldiers' shields, securing a military victory that gave him control over the Western Empire. Events moved rapidly. The Edict of Milan granted Christians legal protection in 313 CE. By 325 CE, the same emperor who once persecuted the movement held absolute authority over its highest council. Within 12 generations of the execution of Jesus, the descendants of persecuted peasants became the chief administrators of the Roman state. The physical spaces and symbols of the faith underwent a structural transformation across 4 areas: symbol, gathering, question, and status. The cross transitioned from a wooden instrument of state execution into a jeweled imperial standard. The gathering space changed from the house church, where different classes met across economic lines, to the Roman basilica. The basilica is a law court architectural form designed for hierarchy and spectacle. Ethics were replaced by doctrine. The question, "How are you living?" became, "What do you believe about the nature of Christ?" Simultaneously, community-supported servant leaders became imperial officials with state salaries and coercive legal power. When a radical movement is invited into the imperial palace, its egalitarian ethics cannot pass through the doors. The visual representation of Jesus shifted from a Galilean wisdom teacher into Christus Pantocrator, a cosmic divine ruler styled after the Roman emperor. Theological additions justified this change. Substitutionary atonement reframed the cross as a cosmic transaction for divine justice, distancing it from its history as imperial execution. Bodily resurrection became the sole focal point and litmus test of the faith. Codified in the Creed, this emphasis overshadowed the ethical teachings of the historical Jesus. Subversion was spiritualized. Radical political practices like enemy love became private, interior sentiments that did not threaten military conquest. This period created a divide between the historical Jesus of the first century and the Christ of faith engineered by imperial theology at Nicaea. When the court theologian Eusebius named Constantine the friend of God, the empire had successfully absorbed and neutralized its greatest ideological threat. By 380 CE, Emperor Theodosius made this synthesized Nicene Christianity the exclusive state religion. All other forms of the tradition, including the communities that preserved non-canonical texts, became legally vulnerable. This transformation followed the gravitational logic of how institutions survive and consolidate power. The result was a palimpsest, a manuscript where the original writing is scraped away to make room for a new text. The state built basilicas and enforced creeds, but the original teachings had already been recorded. These subversive teachings remained in the canonical Gospels and in buried documents like the Gospel of Thomas, even as the institutional layer grew thick above them. The sayings survived. They're still in the texts, identifiable, datable, recoverable, and the largest single cluster of them concerns something he called the kingdom of God. The grammar of empire was written over the tradition, but the original anti-imperial ink remains underneath. The phrase kingdom of God appears over 100 times across the earliest sources. It is the most attested teaching in the Q material, and it has been consistently misread for 17 centuries because the translation carries the wrong mental image. That image is often one of physical distance. We visualized castles in the clouds, pearly gates, or a specific geographic location we travel to after death. To understand the original texts, we have to strip away the idea of a destination. The Greek word basilia does not refer to a static territory. It describes an active reign, a dynamic exercise of rule, or a condition of existence. When the earliest texts mention the kingdom, they are not pointing to a post-death location. They are prescribing an alternative, present-tense way of ordering reality. In the L source, material unique to Luke, Jesus is asked when the kingdom will arrive. He answers it does not come with careful observation. He clarifies you cannot point to it locally because the kingdom is already in your midst or among you. This phrasing is mirrored in the Gospel of Thomas. The kingdom is spread out upon the earth and people do not see it. Historians seek cross-attestation. When independent sources like the Synoptic and Thomas traditions align this closely, it points to a core original teaching. These independent sources describe the kingdom as a present reality. The barrier to entry in this earliest layer of the tradition is a matter of human perception. A first-century Galilean lived within a landscape defined by Roman garrisons, imperial tax collectors, and the enforcement of foreign law. The expected architecture of a kingdom in this era was visible in the absolute power of Caesar, violent territorial conquest, organized legions, and a rigid social hierarchy. To declare that an alternative kingdom was already present was a direct, subversive political challenge to the Roman order. Jesus utilized political satire to drive this home, mocking the scale of imperial power by equating his kingdom with the mundane and the overlooked. If this kingdom is an active event happening right now, what does it actually look like? In the mustard seed parable, the kingdom is not compared to a majestic cedar, the traditional symbol of an empire. It is compared to an invasive, uncontrollable weed that subverts the order of a manicured garden. In the leaven parable, a woman mixes yeast into flour. In a first-century context, yeast was a symbol of corruption. Intentionally adding it to a large batch of dough violated strict purity codes. The lost coin parable describes the search for the kingdom not as an apocalyptic event, but as the grounded, relentless attention of a woman sweeping her floor for something already in her house. The kingdom operates in the spaces the empire ignores, hidden in plain sight and embedded in the ordinary. Seeing it requires a shift in the quality of our attention. If the kingdom is a present reality, the standard religious formula of waiting, obeying, and eventually arriving elsewhere is unnecessary. This teaching was later relocated to a future afterlife because early communities, facing persecution, needed the hope of a distant, better world. But the original teaching asks for a different mode of consciousness. Entering the kingdom is not a result of physical death or moral qualification. It is a shift in awareness toward what is already the case. The kingdom is present the way oxygen is present. It is unnoticed not because it is being withheld, but because we have not learned to see it. Which leaves us with a genuinely open question. If the kingdom is already present right here, what is preventing you from seeing it? Entering this reality requires a specific vocabulary for this shift in perception, a word that describes the turning of the mind. That word, metanoia, has been in the texts this entire time, but it has been translated in a way that changed its meaning entirely for every reader and every generation since the 2nd century. For centuries, Western culture has organized its spiritual life around the concept of repentance. We are taught to look backward, assess our failures, and feel a deep sense of contrition. But the original Greek texts record an instruction that was erased when those sources were translated into English, a loss that changed the internal logic of the entire teaching. When Jesus began his public teaching, the earliest records show him using a specific Greek word, metanoia. Metanoia is a compound word. It joins meta, meaning beyond or across, with noia, meaning mind or perception. Its literal meaning is a going beyond the mind, a shift in the very faculty by which a person sees the world. The English word repentance carries a heavy moral weight. It demands that you acknowledge wrongdoing and seek absolution. This framework turns the spiritual life into a series of backward-looking moral assessments. There is a massive functional difference here. One is an invitation to change how you know. The other is a demand to feel bad about what you did. This shift in meaning traces back to a specific moment in the year 382 CE. The scholar Jerome was commissioned to translate the Greek New Testament into the Latin Vulgate, the Bible that would become the authoritative text for Western Christianity for the next 1,000 years. When Jerome reached the word metanoia, he rendered it in Latin as poenitentiam agite, do penance. This choice replaced an invitation to perceptual awakening with a moral transaction. Over time, the Western spiritual focus moved away from transforming consciousness and toward a cycle of sin, confession, and forgiveness. For a millennium, the Greek concept of expanding the mind remained in the manuscripts, but it was obscured by a system focused on the management of guilt. We see what this looks like in the parable of the prodigal son. At the low point of the story, the Greek text says the younger son came into himself. This is not a description of guilt. It is a description of awakening. He suddenly saw his situation clearly and reoriented his life toward his father's house. The father's reaction, running to meet the son while he was still far off, describes the nature of what meets a person who undergoes this shift. By every ancient standard, this was undignified, yet it characterizes the response as welcome, not judgment. This state of unconditioned awareness has parallels in other traditions. In Zen, Shunryu Suzuki called it shoshin, or beginner's mind, a state where the categories of the expert are abandoned in favor of open possibilities. Similarly, the Sufi concept of tauba, often translated as turning, describes a movement of the whole person toward what is real. In both Zen and Sufism, the primary barrier is not a lack of goodness, but the persistence of mental habit. Across these traditions, the problem is not a moral failure to be punished. The problem is a constricted way of seeing that keeps the individual from perceiving the reality that is already present. This context changes how the parables function. They are not moral instructions about how to behave. They are designed to collapse the listener's existing categories and force a new way of seeing. The mustard seed, the yeast, the treasure in the field, these do not describe behaviors to emulate. They describe the quality of perception that sees the kingdom already present and reorganizes around it. These parables are engineered to leave the listener in a state of perceptual openness. You don't enter the kingdom by being good enough. You enter it by seeing differently. A man is robbed on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Two religious officials pass him and cross to the other side. The third figure who stops, the one who helps, is a Samaritan. Centuries of retelling have smoothed the story's edges. We recognize the Good Samaritan as a moral archetype, a lesson in stopping to help a stranger. But the original audience heard something different. This is a photograph of the inn on the Jericho Road, an isolated, dangerous stretch of desert terrain. In the 1st century, a man bleeding out on this dirt was a brutal reality, not a hypothetical scenario for a morality play. These texts go beyond illustrating virtues. They function as events that happen to the listener. For a 1st century Judean audience, a Samaritan was a despised ethnic and religious enemy. They worshipped at the wrong temple, read an edited Torah, and were excluded from community life. When the priest and the Levite walk past the man, they are adhering to ritual purity laws that forbid contact with a corpse. By positioning the hated outsider as the only one who acts with dignity, the story suggests that religious identity is no measure of moral worth. The lawyer who originally asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" was looking for a legal boundary to define his obligations. Instead, the story forces him to acknowledge his enemy as the moral center of the situation. The category of neighbor expands until the original legal question is rendered meaningless. The listener is left to grapple with their own realization. Scholars like Robert Funk and John Dominic Crossan describe parables as language events, acts of meaning-making that disrupt the listener's world rather than describing it. These stories follow a specific architecture. Every parable establishes a familiar, recognizable world where the listener can find their footing. Once inside that world, the logic collapses. The narrative pivots into a reversal, leaving the listener without a resolution. Institutions eventually made these stories safe because their original force threatened the structures that communities use to maintain their social order. In the parable of the prodigal son, the audience naturally focuses on the younger son's wasteful exit and his dramatic return. However, the story is actually aimed at the older brother. He stayed at home, he worked hard, and followed the rules. He represents the responsible and faithful listener. The story ends with this older brother standing outside the celebration, consumed by his own resentment. The father pleads with him to enter, but the narrative cuts to black before he answers. You are left on the porch with him, forced to decide whether his obedience has actually become a cage. It is a trap for those who organize their lives around doing the right thing. This structural sabotage also challenges economic assumptions. The story of the workers in the vineyard depicts laborers receiving equal pay for unequal work. It is engineered to generate outrage, confronting the listener's belief in a merit-based system. It extends even to images of divine power. The prophet Ezekiel described God's kingdom as the cedar of Lebanon, stately, permanent, and vast. Jesus replaced that image with the mustard plant. This was a wildly invasive weed that farmers pulled from their gardens because it contaminated other crops. This choice suggests a kingdom that spreads like a pest from the margins, rather than growing from a throne at the center. Each story leaves the listener in a state of irresolution. The Good Samaritan leaves us in the dirt with an enemy. The prodigal son leaves us stranded outside a party. If a parable is fully understood, it hasn't been heard. The intended outcome is discomfort. This strategy appears in other traditions as well. Zen koans, like the riddle of one hand clapping, and Hasidic teaching stories share this function. They are designed to exhaust the rational mind and crack the predictable world open. These stories were designed to trigger metanoia, a restructuring of the mind. By dismantling legal, moral, and economic categories, the parables leave the listener in a disorienting new space. This experience of being stranded is what the teacher called the kingdom. The mechanism of the parables reaches its most explicit and public form in one location, a hillside in Galilee, before a crowd of people living under Roman occupation, where what he said was so politically dangerous that the empire spent 3 centuries trying to defuse it.